Hi everyone, this is Achutabhava from Nightlight Astrology. I am here today doing a live cast to talk about tomorrow's lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. I am going to finally be returning home tomorrow after being with some family. And so I wanted to hop on today and do a live cast to talk about the eclipse tomorrow and what you can expect or what you might notice. And I'm going to do so on two different levels and also take questions from you guys if you have them. The first level that I'll talk about it is obviously within the collective. So we'll talk about the collective dimension of the eclipse in Sagittarius. Then we'll talk about the personal dimension, and I'm going to go through the houses, rising sign by rising sign, where that Sagittarius eclipse is going to fall if you're a Virgo rising or if you're a Cancer rising, whatever the case might be. So we're going to do that together today. Plus, I'll answer whatever questions you have about the eclipse as best as I'm able to. So if you have questions about the eclipses, feel free to put them in the chat box as we go. In the meantime, I want to just make a few announcements. One is that my new class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, begins on June 14th. The early bird discount is in effect for all the way up until the 14th, which you can save $500 off. There's a full tuition with payment plan, and then we do have need-based tuition for people who are out of a job due to COVID-19 or who are struggling in any way. For like 10 years, right? My wife and I, over the past 10 years, we had a yoga studio, and we've in our home at first, we had a home that we rented out. We had a in-house yoga studio, and then we eventually got our own location. And so for about 10 years, we had a donation-based yoga, and I've always done my content for free, and then do a donation-based fundraiser at the end of the year. And we've always done need-based tuition for all of our herbal, astrology, and yoga classes. So I always try to make astrology really accessible to people so that people are getting astrology, not just who have a bunch of money, but really anyone. So we really don't turn people away. So if for any reason you're struggling right now, please feel free to reach out. I also just want to make an announcement, which I'm really excited about, which is that my wife and I have also decided to offer a certain number of diversity scholarships for our programs, hopefully by the end of the year, in our next enrollment period in the fall. And I've done this after just listening to a lot of my friends and clients and students speak over the past week with everything that's happening in the world right now, and just thinking, how can I be a better steward, and how can I use my platform to impact change for the better in the world right now? I see this as a really historical moment that we're living through, and I'm trying to listen more than talk, but also trying to use my platform to do my part as I can. And so the idea here for us is very simple. Astrology to me is like it's a medicine for the soul, and it helps to awaken the soul. And on that level, I think that astrology is something that can be good for all people everywhere. I think that it can do nothing but help if there are people of all colors and all backgrounds, especially in minority groups, who are practicing teaching others about astrology. So my wife and I are just thinking, how can we help to ensure that going forward there is more diversity in our fields of astrology and of herbalism? Because that's how this soul medicine gets to more people. If you're sitting around and you're like, who's someone in my community that looks like me, or that feels more comfortable for me to relate to, that I could find in order to learn or study more about my birth chart or astrology, it's going to be more accessible for people. So strategically, I see this as a way of making sure that the soul medicine of astrology can come through. If we create more diversity in the field of astrology, it's going to mean that more people get the soul medicine. So anyway, that's why we're doing it, and we're going to create a certain number of diversity scholarships by the end of the year, where people in minority groups, kind of a broad umbrella, we're going to create of different minorities, and hopefully make these full scholarships for people who otherwise couldn't afford but have a real passion for astrology or herbalism, and we'll give them full scholarship and also pay for their books and their professional astrology software and things like that. So at any rate, okay, so that's everything that I wanted to share with you guys at the beginning. Now I'd like to dive into the astrology of the eclipse in Sagittarius, which is happening tomorrow. Let's talk about what makes this such a powerful eclipse for starters. And hi, everyone. I'm seeing your comments now, and I'll get to your questions after I go through some of the basics. The eclipse is unique for basically two reasons that I see as the top two reasons that this eclipse is unique. Just to answer Eric's question regarding the scholarships that I just mentioned, we're not going to be able to put that into place until the end of the year in our next enrollment period. So just stay tuned, because I'll be announcing it on YouTube, on my newsletter, on my social media platforms. If you follow me on Facebook, that's typically where I make more announcements about like what I'm doing to help, or what kind of the latest stuff that I'm up to, or whatever, or Instagram, or my newsletter. Those are the places to find that information. Anyway, so this is a unique eclipse for two basic reasons. One is it's the first eclipse that we're having in the signs of Sagittarius and Gemini, and there's a bunch of them coming. So it's pretty unique to see like what is this going to be like? Well, we're going to get a taste for it. So I always think of the first eclipse happening when the nodes change signs as really indicative of what's to come. The second reason that I see this eclipse as major is because you've got the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius in almost a perfect square to Mars in Pisces. Now so you got a lunar eclipse in a fire sign square to Mars. That's tempestuous, right? That's a very like powerful dynamic eclipse. So let's break that down a little bit more. The lunar eclipse in Sagittarius is in Jupiter's sign, and square to Mars in Pisces. Mars in Pisces is also Jupiter's sign. So, excuse me, there's a lot of Jupiterian emphasis behind this, and yet there's a lot of Mars emphasis behind this as well. The moon is like a mirror in ancient astrology. The moon, whatever the moon's doing, it usually is reflective of what it's surrounded with or who it's in relationship with. Just like the moon is not an original light, it's a reflective light. So the moon acts as this kind of cosmic mirror. Well, what is it mirroring? It's mirroring fire, and it's mirroring Jupiter. It's mirroring the centaur, and it's mirroring Mars. And all of this, Mars too, reflects back to Jupiter's conjunction with Pluto while it's retrograde and in its fall in the sign of Capricorn. So that's so intense, first of all, because you've got, let's talk about Jupiter and Capricorn underlying both Mars and the moon. Jupiter is in its fall, which is the sign where Jupiterian themes are, they fall on hard times. And then when it hits Pluto, it's catalyzed by the release of this kind of subterranean force that's been pent up, waiting to blow like a volcano for a really long period of time. Slow, grinding, transformative forces that are going to just, they're very like nuclear. So Jupiter's hitting that in its fall, right as the lunar eclipse in the fire sign of Jupiter is hitting the square to Mars. That's so much, right? So what does Jupiter represent? Jupiter is going to represent moral, cosmological, spiritual, societal unity. And not just one unity. I mean, in a spiritual sense, it points to the grand laws of the universe, the laws of karma, the greater laws that hold everything together, that are deeply mysterious, that astrology itself points to. So that's like Jupiterian. But, of course, on the human level, we try to construct a society that can bring order and unity. And why do we do that? Well, it relates back to other planets. And this is something that I never forget. The first time I heard an astrologer talk about this a couple of years ago, it was really pretty mind-blowing for me. Anyway, in Indian astrology, one of the ways of thinking about it goes like this. So the soul has desire. And there's not just one soul here. Last time I checked, there's a lot of us, right? So it's like, so we all have desires. Desires for what? Well, desire for happiness. That's what the soul wants, is, some form of happiness or satisfaction or gratification. So that's Venus, just the desire for to be pleased, to be happy. But then we're dealing in the material world with resources and energies that are coming into being and going out of being, coming into being and going out of being. And so, and there's also the impulse to try to hoard and dominate resources then for ourselves in order to gratify ourselves. So this happens in nature all the time. You can see it all over the place, from in really simple ways, like watching my daughters fight for the attention of my wife or myself, or in really complicated ways, like suppressing people and their rights to vote or their rights to have equal opportunities in the world. But there is competition, struggle, dominance, oppression, and fighting over the different material energies that we think are going to bring us happiness and satisfaction. So in other words, we want happiness, Venus, but we have to go out and we sort of try to compete for it, or we may even be tricked into trying to dominate each other in relation to those things that we want and we desire. So that's the Mars-Venus on a philosophical level. Well, where does Jupiter play a role? Well, Jupiter comes in and says, look, everybody, here's democracy, or here's a system of justice, or here's a system of religion, or here's some grand unifying teaching or principle or institution or ideology that can create unity so that these diverse forces that exist within all of us can be kept together, coherent, right? So the laws of a city, the justice system, the Constitution, right? Or the doctrines and teachings of a church or whatever. The problem is, of course, that all unities, the human-made unities, they end at some point. Rome was not built in a day, and it also doesn't last forever. Any material unity, even the solar system, which is a kind of unity, eventually dies. So where there's Jupiter, there's also Saturn. And Saturn is going to represent winter and decay and death and impermanence. In the human world of material energy, in other words, we do our best. We try to create some systems of unity to help us deal with these impulses that we have and are contending with as forces of nature, to try to create and mirror in the human experience the higher spiritual laws of reality. But because they're rooted in material energies too, and because they're made and imagined and created by human people, right? They reflect our own imperfections, and they reflect impermanence, and they eventually die and they eventually fall apart. The solar system will die someday. That's the idea. Even the solar system, right? So physicists tell us this. So where there's Jupiter, different systems of worldly man-made order, eventually they fall apart. When do they fall apart? Well, they often fall apart when Jupiter goes into Capricorn, and this isn't a mistake. Jupiter was said to be exalted in the sign of Cancer. Cancer was called the gateway of man, and it ruled by the moon, and it represented the descent of the soul into the body, the descent of spirit, of the eternal spirit soul, into a temporary material holder, like a body. Capricorn was called the gateway of the gods, and in the beginning of winter, it represents the exodus of the spirit soul from the body. That's why it's Saturn ruled. Saturn is it's the dimmest, most distant planet, closest to the invisible sphere of the spiritual realm, and is also linked to death and the transmigration of the soul from one body to the next, and hopefully eventually back home to God. So the But the idea in ancient astrology is that Capricorn represented the gateway of the gods, as in it's the gateway of the departure of the spirit soul from the body. It represents death and winter. So winter is coming in that regard when Jupiter hits Capricorn. This is why astrologers predict things like pandemics and recessions and potential wars or destructions or the breakdown of civic structures in society when Jupiter hits Capricorn. What to speak of Pluto, with modern Western astrologers who use Pluto. So now take Jupiter and put it in Capricorn, where these larger structures that are, it's a healthy thing to create. I'm not saying it's not at all. We need these kinds of structures, obviously, because we live in a human world. And this human world was also thought of as divine. This world, you could say, from the ancient astrological standpoint, is like a beautiful divine AI program that allows people who are interested in pretending like they're separate from God to have experiences in like a program that sort of allows us to, it's like a choose your own adventure book, but it's taking place in a realm of shadows, because when we live from a place of thinking that we're separate from divinity, then, you know, all of our adventures play out in a shadowy version of the truth, because we're just not separate from divinity, right? So then we go about this world and trying to accomplish a level of happiness that's impossible, both because we'll die someday and we can't get comfortable here, but also because anything that we try to take in for gratification is fleeting, and any kind of larger system that we try to create to uphold order and unity eventually collapses in the material sense. So these collapses are meaningful for so many different reasons. For one, they help us to create better systems of order, justice, truth, goodness, fairness, equality, love, respect for all people. These collapses, when Jupiter goes into Saturn's sign and is in its fall and conjoined with Pluto, spell destruction for things that aren't working. So great, we can build a better thing that's not working. But it also serves a spiritual purpose, which can't be overlooked, which is to remind us that none of these structures ever will do it for us. None of these institutions. We can't build a utopia here. So there's two things that these accomplish. It's like you're on a sinking ship, you know? It would be irresponsible. The idea here is that it would be irresponsible not to try to keep bailing water, even if you're on a sinking ship. Make the world a better place. Leave it better than you found it. Act as though you can make it heaven. Even if the solar system itself will die someday, act as though it is your spiritual responsibility to make it a better place. But at the same time, remember the bigger picture, which is that all things pass, all things die. And that realization can take us more deeply into the spiritual path, which has to accompany the moral and worldly reconstructions that we're doing. So that there's a duality at work in Saturn always. Saturn is the god of oppositions in ancient astrology, that represents the dichotomy between that which is established and that which is marginalized, that which is dominant and that which is cast out. But also, Saturn is ultimately the one who frustrates us when we think that any kind of project here in the material world will give the soul, the immortal spiritual soul, what it's looking for. So people take that dichotomy and they think, well, either I focus on spiritual life, right? And then that means that, I shouldn't care so much about political life or the imperfections of the world. See, I'm thinking transcendentally here. I'm like above all of that. Or they think in the opposite direction. They think spirituality isn't looking, thinking about eternity is missing the mission and the practical thing that needs to happen right in front of me. And people dichotomize along these lines. And in doing so, they're both are the ego's defenses against spirituality, which asks us to be crucified right in between the middle of those two things. That's the shape of the cross as an alchemical symbol. But no, this is why at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is standing with Arjuna on the battlefield, and Arjuna is faced with a terrible civil war. His own people. He's like, yeah, this can't be right. That these two sides are always fighting, and like, I'm just gonna like, can I just like check out? This feels irresponsible. I don't want to kill people that I should be loving. I don't want to fight and oppose people, right? But there's injustice here. And Krishna's like, yeah, well, real yoga doesn't happen in a cave. It's not a solo Olympian deadlift of your existence into, the monad. You're not just shooting out of your crown chakra and blending into God and saying, all of this injustice is just an illusion anyway. That's a cop-out. So somewhere between, these two things, we find ourselves, and Krishna's like, look, you have to fight. You have to be on this battlefield of life, and you have to stand up for the right thing. It's not easy, but that's yoga. The real yoga is, how do I be absolutely dedicated to God in my heart, knowing that none of this means anything ultimately, while also treating it as though it is the exact material for my devotional relationship with God that God is putting in front of me. This is the alchemical material that God's saying, yeah, this is what I want you to work with to get closer with me. If you want to know me, understand me, if you want me to dwell in you and you to dwell in me, which is the ultimate source of all bliss and happiness, love, truth, and light, real truth and light, then do this. Work it out within the context of your existence. Work it out within the context of what's happening in the world right now. That's real yoga. So this moment calls for us to look at the challenge of reforming and restructuring different paradigms, different structures of unity, whether they're personal and very intimate, that they have to do with our time, money, energy, resources, in very personal ways and professional ways, in our relationships, or if they're bigger and more societal. And it says, look at this, work on it, change it, make it better. You see, the darkness is exposed. But it also says you have to do it within the standpoint of eternity. You have to be able to hold it within the standpoint of being an eternal spiritual being. And this is why Jesus said that the first teaching, was love God with everything you are. And everyone has a different way of understanding that word. A lot of people have been hurt by the word God. Krishna is the word I use. Some people say God. Some people say universe. The important thing is it's personal. It lives in your heart and it's personal. And connect with it, because that's what makes you a soul, not just a cog in the machine. That's what makes us a soul. But then, again, at the same time, it's okay. What was the second commandment? The second greatest commandment was love others as you love yourself. And so each of us, if we take that personal call to spiritual life seriously and we work on it as though it is the most important thing in our existence, then we'll be successful on the battlefield. Then we'll know where to act and how to act, where to put our energy and how to use it. So, but they go together. They can't be separated. So that is my message about what's happening in the collective right now. And the Mars energy is catalyzing it. This is why I was talking, like last month, I talked about Mars and the Greek word for martyr, which meant a witness, someone who sees the truth and speaks about it. So the traditional meaning of Mars as a martyr is in the air right now. How could we see this play out in the collective? Well, the scariest thing would be to see people being, for example, I have a friend who's in the National Guard, and he wrote openly on Facebook saying, I don't know if I could ever, if I got called right now, I don't know that I believe in standing against my fellow citizens. is a constitutional crisis in a sense. You know what I mean? That's Mars. That's the complication of Mars in the air right now. It's like, oh, well, there was an op-ed or something in the New York Times yesterday talking about call in the military, right? This is, these kinds of, what do you stand for? And what are you willing to die for? What will you be a witness for? Why so charged, so charged. So the collective level of this, my fear, and I can't, I don't want to scare people. So sometimes people think, oh, astrologers, they really know what's going on. And it's like, we're just like educated weather, like weathermen, we have some sense. It's like, I would hate to think that this Mars energy would call in the military with the protests that are happening right now, or that the protests would become more violent, and that therefore some of the important messages and movements of change would become compromised in some way, in even greater ways. So any way in which violence could be entering into the collective, um, especially over battling ideologies, political, social, moral, religious, whatever, that's scary right now. That's a real scary reality of the lunar eclipse square to Mars. Because even though systems are being exposed and may need to change with the Jupiter-Pluto dynamic, there's also going to be competing and conflicting ideas about what that means. And unfortunately, the worst expression would be, rather than civil discourse, passionate civil discourse would be for violence. So I think that's the worst case scenario. I think the best case scenario is the catharsis and the feeling of needing to take action and do something to challenge those Jupiterian containers, the Jupiterian unities that we try to establish in our lives. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say about the collective. Okay, so personal. I'm going to go through the 12 signs now. And I think what we'll do is, what I'm going to do is just run through where the eclipse is based on your rising sign and what to watch for. And I'll just try to do a little treatment of that. And then I'm going to run back and look through your questions if you have them as well. So let's start with Aries. If you are an Aries rising in your birth chart and you're using whole sign houses, the Sagittarius eclipse will fall in your 9th house. Excuse me. With that comes an emphasis on the higher mind, specifically on education or learning, religion and spirituality, maybe something to do with foreign countries or foreign places or travel. And you're also thinking about Sagittarius in the 9th house. It's called the joy of the sun, real illuminating insights that can come into your life right now. A lot of lessons around anger, frustration, and action with your ruling planet Mars if you're an Aries in the 12th house at the same time. So I would look to the eclipses that are going to start happening in your 9th house if you're an Aries rising, and go like, your next year and a half is going to have a lot to do either with learning something new teachers or mentors entering your life, or a transformation of your religious or spiritual beliefs, or the theme of mobilizing your beliefs in the world somehow. It's real powerful for Aries. So that's my Aries like mini forecast. Excuse me. Taurus rising, you're going to find Sagittarius in your 8th house. Now that's going to have to do with debts and obligations that you have to other people. A lunar eclipse in the 8th can bring about the almost like paying off debts, or the conclusion or resolution of debts that you have to other people karmically. The 8th house is so much to do with our debts to others, or other people that have debts to us emotionally, spiritually, financially. It can also be a place of death and loss, and of the inevitable karmic sort of consequences that come in and oftentimes take something away from us. It was a house that was associated with penalties, especially financial penalties. But yeah, this eclipse can signal changes also in the dynamics of shared resources, income, and investments that involve other people, things like that. Those would be some of the main themes that I would look at. Then let's go forward to Gemini rising. If you're a Gemini rising, this is going to fall into your whole sign 7th house of relationships and marriage. And that means that you're going to, well, it can mean you're reaching some kind of crescendo or culmination in a relationship. Sometimes that means a breakup. But other times it can signal that there is a really important shift happening for a loved one or a partner. They're changing jobs, something's happening in their family. The highlight of the 7th house eclipse, or the focus of the 7th house eclipse, may be more on something happening with a partner and in their life than in your own. Or it can highlight the topic of relationships generally, of your sexuality, or potentially meeting somebody new, or of a relationship coming to some kind of critical transformational point. So that's your Sagittarius. That's if you're Gemini rising. Let's move it along if you're a Cancer rising. So if you're a Cancer rising, this will fall into your 6th house. And the 6th house is traditionally was called the joy of Mars and the house of bad fortune. And it can speak to health and health problems. It can speak to just challenges and frustrations and difficulties, or a period of hard work or intense labor working on something. It can also signal some kind of it was associated with Mars, the military, with conflicts and enemies traditionally. And well, you can see like the hard labor aspect of the 6th, or sometimes just conflicts that come up in life with 6th house eclipses. Now those conflicts are always karmic, so there's always something to be learned from them. And oftentimes 6th house eclipses mean that you're going to be laboring through something in the next, say, year and a half that will ultimately lead to results, but will require a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So it's normal if you're feeling the burden. The 6th house is kind of like hard work under the hot sun. It feels like that. So that's it was. Oh, for example, the 6th house was connected to like farms and farming. You can think of it that way too. Okay, so let's go on to Leo rising. Leo rising the eclipse is gonna fall in your 5th house. Sagittarius is in your 5th whole sign house if you're a Leo rising, and that's going to be a house that's related to things like pregnancy and children, as well as things like pleasure and joy and happiness and recreation and creativity. 5th house was called the house of good fortune, and it was called the joy of Venus. It has everything to do with our desire for whatever is pleasing or happy or joyful. And for some people, that's going to be something really creative and colorful, like dance or painting or music. For other people, it's going to be about sex and procreation and romance. So a number of different ways of thinking about it. But eclipses in this house typically mean, for example, that if there's anything that's really excessive around pleasure in your life, you drink too much or you spend too much, or if a person has like a gambling problem, or if there's anything that in the name of pleasure I go too far with, the eclipses will start bringing consequences. So you do want to watch for that. On the other hand, it can be about the birth of a child. It can be about deeper changes happening in your children's lives or in your relationship with your children. It can also refer to the topic of pleasure and joy and creativity and romance, and the need for more of it, or some new creative inspiration that's starting to come through. All right, let's go forward to Virgo. So Virgo rising, you're going to place it in the 4th house. The eclipse in Sagittarius falls in your whole sign 4th. It's going to point to issues around home and family, property, parents, ancestral karma, the past, ancient history. The 4th house is traditionally related to the occult and to mysteries. So there can also be an emphasis on seeking things out that are hidden or deep or mysterious. All of these topics, especially family karma, will be really pronounced if you're a Virgo rising. Let's go ahead to Libra rising. If you're a Libra rising, it falls in your 3rd house. 3rd house is going to be related to siblings, neighbors, your local or immediate environment, short journeys or travel that has some relationship to your family or your roots, especially. Also things like media, communication, sometimes learning. But your immediate environment, there's a lot of a lot of busyness and things that are happening around you. Third house eclipses often coincide when a person is writing a book or studying something new or getting into a new hobby or developing a new online platform of some kind, or dealing with changes in the just like the environment around you, your home, your family, your neighborhood, in the lives of siblings. But it has that real kind of like, I always call it, the third house has a real folk kind of feeling to it, and also it places an emphasis on needing to devote ourselves to things and to communicate or express ourselves in the world, especially our ideas. So those are some things you could watch for with third house eclipse if you're a Libra rising. We go forward a little bit, you're Scorpio rising, then you're going to see this energy of the eclipse in your second house, which is the place of money, finances, resources, potential for real changes around money and finances. With eclipses, sometimes the means by which you make money will change. Also, there can be uh, lunar eclipses in the second house can bring this theme of, you know, debts or obligations. A second house is traditionally associated with both income and expenditures. So eclipses bring big changes around those topics. So your financial reality shifting quite a bit in the next year and a half. If you're Scorpio rising, if you're Sagittarius rising, it's very personal. It's about self because it's in your first house. Identity, health, the body, psychology, your sense of dharma, meaning your sense of obligation or duty. What am I essentially, and how am I uh, acting in accord with my essential nature in the world? It's more existential and inward focused, you could say. It's also inceptional. The first house starts new things. So watch for that if you're Sag rising. Go forward to Capricorn rising. It's in your 12th house. Your 12th house, it's going to bring up the but potential themes of self-destructiveness. You're going to have to look at different ways in which you are working against yourself. You also may have to deal with forces, influences, or people around you who are not healthy for you or who are undermining you in some way. You're also going to be looking at the topic of solitude or need for more contemplative space to reflect, and also some degree of distance from the world to reconsider your beliefs and values. That's 12th house material. All right, so let's go forward to Aquarius rising. If you're an Aquarius rising, it's going to fall into your 11th house. You're going to be focused on friends, groups, allies, benefactors, wishes, and dreams. The 11th house is called the joy of Jupiter in the house of good spirit, and it was traditionally associated with anyone that might act as an ally in your life, usually toward your worldly ambitions, your professional ambitions, but could also represent allies in a larger communal sense, which is why the 11th house eventually gets associated with groups. But the gist of it is that eclipses in this house will change the social fabric of your life in one way or another, professional or just in terms of your friends, religious or political. But the fabric of your social connections will change a great deal, and sometimes with a little bit of pain, or the transformation is not always easy. That's if you're an Aquarius rising. Finally, if you are a Pisces rising, this falls in your career house. Pisceans, this is catalyzing you in a very personal way with that Mars energy in your first house, facing a more confrontational energy perhaps at work in the immediate future. But over the next year and a half, you think about big changes happening in relation to your work in the world, your reputation in the world, your public involvement out in the society you live in, and your vocation in a general sense. Now, vocation doesn't have to mean your 9 to 5. It can mean, as in the Greek word praxis that was given to the 10th house, what you practice in the world. So just whatever you're doing. So watch for that when it comes to the 10th house. Okay, so that's a little personal take on the eclipses through the houses. I am going to scroll up and just see if you have any questions for me about the eclipses that I can answer. Cameron asks, does an eclipse's power come from the blended energies of the moon and the node it's conjoining, or from ... Good question, Cameron. Thank you. It's going to be which node, Rahu or Ketu, and of course, if you want to go with the more you start getting into Indian astrology, the more that the nodes really color the eclipses. So a Ketu event, moksha and of liberation from the world, which is why that martyr energy in the air is something I've been, kind of focused on, because the giving up of the body, for the sake of a larger mission or cause, you really feel that with K2 in the air right now. And it could be metaphorical, not literal, but the sacrifice, the sacrificial element, the liberation, the focus on moksha, that's that's K2. So right, so that makes sense for just this eclipse is happening, of course, around the south node. So that would be the K2 influence. But generally, the way that I look at it is where is the moon by sign, and who is its host, and what's happening with the host or aspects to the moon. In Western astrology, I think that probably is more of the emphasis, but you get into Indian astrology, you're going to emphasize the influence of the spec. I can answer more quickly. How do we reach out regarding scholarships? I mentioned that earlier. Those diversity scholarships that I mentioned, I'll be talking about by the end of the year. It's going to take us a little bit to get it all set up. So just stay tuned to my newsletter. In a passionate and expressive fashion. Yeah, there's a lot of emotions, and sometimes I think the intense emotion of the moment, Mars in a water sign, is bringing out the underlying decay of different Jupiterian systems of unity that need to be questioned. And it's also, there's a way in which that emotion can be like gasoline, even weirdly because it's water, but it can be like gasoline on a fire. It can be turned into like boiling water. So it can go quickly off into a more destructive mode potentially. It doesn't have to, but it can. Let's see. My ascendant and Neptune are 28 degrees Sag. Can a relationship work when you meet someone new when Venus is retrograde? So you have the Venus retrograde in your 7th. I'd be cautious. I'd be optimistic but cautious until about August when Venus is out of Gemini. It's like proceed with it. I'm just joking, but like if you meet someone right now when Venus is retrograde, I'm almost like, just imagine that you went out on a date with a person and you drank a whole bottle of wine together. You had a ton of fun. There was great chemistry, but there was wine involved. You know what I mean? So like, check back the next day. Do they look like a hairy monster the next day? You know what I mean? So Venus retrograde, I'd just be a little cautious with like, oh, I'm going to get this new tattoo. See what you feel about that image of that tattoo you're going to get maybe when Venus is fully out of the retrograde cycle. And if you still love it, then cool. Otherwise, proceed as if you may be a little intoxicated. That's my, that's how I handle it anyway. Is that to do with Dharma, when you live well even though this world is fleeting? Yeah, I believe so. I believe that's the idea. Yeah. Seeking the middle road between hedonism and asceticism. What techniques do you use to predict events with an eclipse period following new full moons, hitting previous eclipse marks? Which is 100% reliable? Keep it simple. There was a phrase, I know this is kind of mean, but there was a phrase that I remember, like one of my like sports coaches saying, keep it simple, stupid. It's not nice, but you've heard that before. So keep it simple. Look at the eclipses across house axis points. If you're talking personally with natal charts, across house axis points, look at if the eclipses are falling on the degrees of natal planets. Look at if they're falling with the north or south node. Look at if they are where the rulers are when they're happening. That'll usually give you the most specific information. Natal context is everything. Everything that's happening in the sky is filtered back through the parameters of the kshetra, the field of karma that we're born into, which is defined by the birth chart. So you always have to take the context of the natal chart into account as well. The just action at the just time with the just state of being is the work of a lifetime. Yes. And practice makes perfect. You know, just I think that as we say, my guru says that Krishna, for example, in Krishna Bhakti, cares time with the just state of being more than even whether or not we actually stick the landing. So it's just important that our hearts be in the right place, that we keep trying and doing our best. That's all I can do, I know. So I'm just going to keep trying. So, great haircut. I didn't get a haircut, but if you like my hair, I'm happy. Even if, let's go down. Is the Mars energy calling in the military or the powers that be using this energy to call in these actions? That would be one of my fears about this, would be that the Mars energy would result in more of a martial quality, especially with Jupiter in Capricorn. That could go that way, and that's a little scary. So I'm not crazy about that, but it is definitely a fear that I have looking at the forecast at the moment. Let's see. Is there an east-west node? Why only north-south? Good question. The north and south nodes of the moon are related to the moon's latitude, its path, relative to the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun. So if you can think of like a big arc in the sky, which is the sun, the moon's path is snaking around it, going up and then snaking down and then going up. And so it's like a snake winding around the path of the sun. It intersects the path of the sun at 2 points, one while ascending upward toward the pole star, one while descending downward toward the southern horizon. So when it goes up toward the pole star and crosses, that's the north node, down toward the southern horizon, that's going to be the south node. And so there's no east-west because the moon is always moving in east-west all the time. At the same time, the moon is being carried toward the east by the primary motion, or toward the west, excuse me, with the primary motion of the sky, the motion that brings everything from rising to culminating to setting. And in that sense, the moon is always being pulled toward the west. But by its zodiacal motion through the zodiac out in space, gradually moving at a much slower rate than we can see with the visible eye, compared to that rotation of the Earth on its axis, that the primary motion that drags it toward the west, the moon is moving toward the east, zodiacally speaking, through the zodiac. So the moon's motion, all planets are always participating in a duality of motion at the same time. Then the north node is looked at as having an ascending node across the ecliptic of the sun and a descending node. So that's how they're all involved at once. Good question. Okay. Going down. Any other questions before we close down for the day? What about if you don't have any children? I'm guessing you're talking about the fifth house. Is that Raphael? I think that's you. If it's a fifth house eclipse, you're going to be looking at creative endeavors, probably, if not children. Be careful that you don't have children yet. No, I'm just kidding. Always, no joke. I've had so many people. I've been like fifth house eclipses in a client session. They're like, I'm not having kids. I hear from them a year later after eclipse season is winding down. They're like, holy shit, I got pregnant. Excuse my language. So anyway, okay. Don't see any others so far. I'm almost to the bottom. I'm tropical, not Vedic. I incorporate a lot of elements of yoga philosophy into my work, obviously, but I study Hellenistic astrology. I have a background in modern psychological and evolutionary astrology as well. I look at the nodes now through a traditional lens, though not through the evolutionary. Okay, I think hi from Indonesia. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, I think that's just about it. I've gotten to the bottom. Oh, hey, okay, it is you, Raphael. Good to see you. Well, thank you all for hanging out. It was nice to see all of you and to virtually see you and to field some of your questions. I will. I'm finally going to be back home by Saturday, so I'll get back to uh, my regular office space, and things will. But it's been fun doing some of these live casts while I've been here. So maybe I'll do some of them now and then, and just kind of keep that up. I think I've got a lot of good feedback. People enjoy kind of live interactions, so it's fun to hang out with all of you. Remember, one last reminder: my class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, begins on June 14th. You can check it out on my website, nightlightastrology.com. Early bird rate is $500 off. Need-based tuition is there for anyone who's struggling. Try to make it accessible to everybody. The full payment with tuition plan is there as well. And a reminder that by the fall, my wife and I will be putting into place a number of diversity scholarships. I want to say that one more time before I end. It's something that there's a number of things that we're trying to do to be helpful and to use our platform for constructive change right now. And the one thing that I think I'm really excited about that speaks to me is the idea that astrology is soul medicine, and yet souls inhabit many different bodies and many different specific orientations that are unique. It's totally unique to each person. The more that diversity is reflected in the people who teach, practice, and study astrology, the more that the medicine of astrology will get to other people. So to that end, we're going to try to open up. We always have had need-based tuition and try to make it really accessible, but we're going to open up some full scholarships that create a kind of a broad umbrella for supporting minorities, and hopefully that'll do some good in the world. So thank you all for tuning in, and I hope to check in with you again after the weekend. Bye, everyone.